apologize. It's a long one, which I actually just finished reading and loved. I had watched your banner lecture when you came to our museum, and I brushed up on the book before this. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you. For all of our first-time program participants, Kevin will present for about 30 minutes, and then we will take questions until you are tired of us answering your questions. So I will go ahead and turn it over to him to screen share and get started, because he knows this better than we do.
Thanks, Maggie, and great to see all of you. Thanks so much for coming out tonight to talk about, well, in my mind, just one of the great Civil War movies. Even 30 years later, I think Glory just, it still holds up for a number of reasons, and I hope to sort of flesh that out a bit tonight. One of the things I don't want to do tonight is sort of nitpick about Glory. I'm not a big fan of sort of digging in as a historian to, you know, sort of just focus on what it just doesn't quite get right or gets completely wrong. I think quite often we need to sort of understand the difference between history and Hollywood. But I do think there's a lot to learn about how Hollywood embraces the past and how it talks about the past. And it often has an influence on the kind of history we do, how we think about the past. And I think Glory is a great example of that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. And so hopefully all of you, to go back one, hopefully all of you can see the screen. I do want to just sort of start out by just sort of providing just a brief context for this movie. I mean, it really is hard to believe that this movie is 30 years old. It was released in 1989. I think for many of us, it certainly helps to age us. I didn't see it when it first came out. I didn't have any interest in the Civil War or history, for that matter, in 1989. So it was a number of years later, you know, when I first saw the movie. And I've seen it multiple times. I'm sure many of you watching tonight have seen this movie more than once, and I'm sure a number of you can perhaps cite entire scenes by memory. So I've watched it numerous times, and I've taught it in class, in my high school classes when I taught for 11 years in Charlottesville, Virginia, and elsewhere. So this movie was an important part of my Civil War unit, but it was always, for me, you know, an opportunity to talk about that intersection between history and Hollywood. One of the things to keep in mind is that, you know, in 1989, there really wasn't much on the, you know, in popular culture that talked about the, you know, the broad history of emancipation, slavery during the American Civil War, really nothing on the remarkable story of the United States colored troops, the roughly 180,000 Black soldiers who fought in the United States Army during the Civil War. There were a handful of books. I mean, you could read Louis Emilio's you know, memoir of his time in the 54th, A Brave Black Regiment. You could read James McPherson's classic, The Negro Civil War. I think Joe Glathar's Forged in Battle was just coming out at the time. So between Glory and Ken Burns's Civil War, which came out a year later, I think these two programs, the documentary and the movie, were really influential, really important in understanding the shift toward appreciating this larger narrative of emancipation and United States colored troops. I mean, we're now flooded with histories of Black soldiers. A number of movies have come down the pike that feature the story of Black Civil War soldiers. So I think you can't underestimate the influence of Glory. And at the same time, I think it also, I think, perpetuates certain misunderstandings. It goes beyond the historical record in certain ways, and we can certainly talk about that. So what I'm going to do is sort of go through a couple scenes that I think sort of help us understand, you know, what the movie gets right, where it sort of stretches the truth. During the Q&A, we can certainly go to, you know, parts of the movie that you want to focus on. You can ask questions about really any aspect of the movie. let me just, so I want to start off with a wartime photograph of Robert Gould Shaw. Obviously, he is on the right. This is really my favorite photograph of Shaw, that was taken in 1861, I believe, when he was serving in the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. I included the woman on the left because if you're only familiar with the movie, you may have no understanding at all as to who she is. And this is Annie Nealon Haggerty. In fact, she was engaged to Robert Gould Shaw, and they would eventually marry in early May of 1863. So just weeks before the 54th Massachusetts shipped out to South Carolina, these two kids got married. Now, that's important, of course, because the movie says absolutely nothing about Annie Haggerty. She's not mentioned at all. But of course, if you read through Shaw's personal correspondence, and you can read it, his letters have been published in a book called Blue-Eyed Child of Fortune. They are the wartime letters. Many of the letters were written to Annie. I suspect one of the reasons why she's not included in the movie is because none of her correspondence to Robert survived. So I suspect that's one of the reasons. But Shaw ends up being sort of portrayed as the bachelor, right, as the single man going off to war. And so that's something to certainly think about. The movie begins, and I apologize, this was a screenshot from a YouTube video. The movie, of course, begins in September of 1862. It opens up at the beginning of the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. And I took a screenshot of this scene because I think in many ways it helps us set the stage for understanding the main character, and that, of course, is Robert Gould Shaw, played by Matthew Broderick. The movie makes is clearly embracing the white savior story in 1989. I suspect it's probably for Hollywood the only realistic perspective that they would be willing to take on when it comes to telling the story. It's certainly not the only angle they could have taken. They could have focused on any number of men in the 54th Mass that left a written record, including Emilio, who I mentioned, Lewis Douglas, the son of Frederick Douglass, William Carney, who wins the Medal of Honor at the assault on Battery Wagner, which, of course, as you know, ends the movie. So it does focus on Shaw specifically. And, the movie doesn't capture his entire military career. Again, we see him in September of 62, but I love this opening scene because it's a wonderful way of getting into the process of emancipation, right? As the Army of the Potomac, as Union armies are moving into the Confederacy, in this case, this is still the state of Maryland remains in the Union, but as these armies are moving, enslaved people are flocking to the armies. They are taking the initiative to free themselves. And so what you see are enslaved people sort of moving past the Union army, seeking their freedom. Shaw's view of slavery evolves very, very slowly in my mind. He, I think, begins the war, I think, decidedly on the side of, this is a war about union. This is a war about preserving the Union. I think his letters make that very clear. He comes from an abolitionist family, there's no doubt about that. But Shaw spent most of the 1850s in Europe. He was not in the midst of the sort of growing sectional debate, in the United States over the issue of slavery in the Western territories. He does read the newspapers. He did read Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But he sort of enters the war, I suspect, as the vast majority of loyal white Northerners did. And that is that this is a war about the preservation of the Union. He doesn't say much in his letters early on about slavery. He's even stationed at Harper's Ferry for a brief period of time. He comments on African Americans in that area, but he says, again, very little about sort of that this is a war that is going to fundamentally upend the institution of slavery. So I think it's important to understand that Shaw that this war could have ended before the beginning of 1863 with the preservation of the Union. And I suspect that Shaw, like most white Northerners, would have believed that everything that that needed to be accomplished would have been accomplished, right? Again, namely the preservation of slavery. And so let's keep that in mind, because of course we know how this story, because of the movie, we know how this story is going to end for Shaw. But of course, looking forward from his perspective, there's nothing inevitable about Shaw embracing a Black regiment, him, sort of coming into close contact for the very first time with a significant number of African Americans. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. Shaw is, in the movie, the decision, to accept command of the 54th Massachusetts, that takes place apparently while he's at home on leave. There's a scene in their parlor with the Governor John Andrew, with Frederick Douglass, of course, and Shaw is offered the command of this Black regiment. He walks outside, and within a few minutes, conversing with his good friend here, he accepts command. The actual history, of course, is much more complicated. Shaw was, in fact, in Virginia with the 2nd Massachusetts, and the decision to accept command was a much more drawn-out decision on his part. He was actually very unsure of whether he should accept command of the regiment. And this, I think, again, would have captured the view of many white Northerners. He was unconvinced that African Americans could fight in a regiment. He was also, of course, I think this is even more important for Shaw, he was more concerned, I think, about what this might do to his military reputation in terms of future promotions, etc. So this, for him, would have been, like for many of these men who accept command, would have been a risk. Very few of these men who actually accept command of Black regiments in 1863 are abolitionists. I think that's another thing we should keep in mind. And that creates a great deal of tension between enlisted men and their white officers in terms of the relationships that evolve, the ability to command successfully, all the things that go on within a regiment. That dynamic is fraught when it comes to these relationships. But he does eventually accept command in large part because of the influence of his mother. She is clearly the one who has the sort of strongest abolitionist tendencies. And Shaw eventually does accept command in early 1863. So the timing of the movie is also a bit off, because even while the unit is training, you hear references to the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. This regiment is not formed until early 1863. So why the movie makes that decision is really unclear to me, given that the recruitment begins after the Emancipation Proclamation is signed on January 1st of 1863. One of the most interesting aspects of this movie is the way in which the screenwriters choose to characterize the regiment. This is a regiment you are led to believe is made up of fugitive slaves, formerly enslaved men, right? The main characters, many of them, are former slaves. That was anything but the case with the 54th. The 54th Massachusetts was made up almost entirely of free Blacks born in the North. Many of these men were recruited from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, from New York State, a few from Massachusetts. You'd be surprised how few, because in Boston specifically, first, the Black population is relatively small in Massachusetts, but Boston, which has a very vibrant abolitionist community on Beacon Hill, they offered their services to the country in 1861, and they were rebuffed by Lincoln and the Republicans. And so many African Americans are somewhat skeptical. They're sort of weary about offering and volunteering in 1863, given that they offered their services in 1861. I suspect this is partly the Hollywood here, right? This is the that telling a story of former slaves becoming soldiers is much more attractive than telling the story of free blacks who never experienced life as slaves. And so that's a problem, I think, for the movie. I mean, certainly you can find plenty of regiments made up of formerly enslaved men, but for the 54th specifically, that just was not the case. But that is, I think, a crucial theme here, in this movie. The other thing is the way in which they're depicted early on. You see men without uniforms. Many of you know that they go for a significant period of time without being given rifles. This regiment never suffered for anything. This is the unit raised by John Andrew, I should say authorized by John Andrew, the governor of Massachusetts. He had been calling for a black regiment since 1861. And now that he has the opportunity, these men do not suffer for anything. They have uniforms from day one. They have rifles. They are being sheltered, not in tents, but in long buildings, right, with roofs. They're being fed. So again, that also, I think, is part of the narrative that the script writers wanted to play up, right? And this is a story in large part about the men in the regiment coming together, the lead characters, Tripp, Sergeant Rawlins, Jupiter Sharts, etc., and Shaw sort of finally bonding together by the end of the movie. That is sort of the narrative arc, if you will, of the movie. So it certainly takes some license at certain points. It plays very easy with certain facts about the training of the regiment. And again, especially the makeup of the regiment itself. And that sort of theme of from slavery to freedom really sort of emerges in a dramatic way in this scene. I mean, I think it's safe to say this is the scene where Denzel wins his Academy Award. This, of course, is the flogging scene in which Private Tripp is whipped by the Irish drill sergeant for, in their the way they describe it, as deserting. Now he was not deserting; he was just simply absent without leave. But again, those close-up shots of Shaw and here the close-up shots of Tripp really sort of bring out the tension between the well-to-do Boston Brahmin, upper-class white man, and of course the former slave turned soldier. The problem, of course, with this scene, as some of you know, is that flogging as a form of military discipline had already been outlawed by 1861. So this scene would never have taken place. But again, it certainly helps to reinforce that narrative of a unit coming together, right? They're coming together through this, through the experiences of training and eventually battle, right? But these are the challenges they have to overcome along the way. This is at least one of them. I think another, I wish I could have found a color photograph of this scene, but I wasn't able to. But this is another one of those dramatic moments during the training where it's an opportunity for Shaw to bond with his men. And this is over, of course, the realization or the news that these men will be paid less than white soldiers. Normal pay for a month would have been $13. These men were, of course, promised equal pay at the beginning, but they're being paid $10 a month. And then in addition to that, there's a $3 charge for maintenance of uniforms and other things, these men. So in the end, they're being paid $7 a month. Now, this hews fairly closely to the historical record. There was a pay crisis. The problem with the way in which the movie frames this is that it doesn't take place, it doesn't really begin until after Shaw is killed at Wagner. So the movie plays or uses this again to bond. Remember, Shaw takes out his pistol, he shoots, he fires it. He says, if you men won't take any pay, I won't take any pay either. So he's trying to sort of forge that bond with his men. But in reality, this doesn't take place until, I believe, late August or September of 1863. This is weeks after Shaw has already died in battle. And it's a crisis that lasts for months. The 54th Mass and other Black units protested unequal pay right through the end of 1863 into 1864 until June of 1864, until Congress actually authorized equal pay. So this is actually a really important theme in the history of these units, these Black units, that emerges in the movie, but isn't allowed to develop, of course, because the movie ends with Shaw's death at Battery Wagner in July of 1863. But that it includes it, I think, is an important point. It's important to emphasize it, that it does highlight the kind of discrimination that African Americans faced during the Civil War. It's actually much, much worse than this. When these men protest through 1864, in the 55th Massachusetts, roughly 70 men threatened to mutiny at one point. One man was actually executed for threatening his commanding officer. So this becomes a very serious crisis among the 54th, within the 54th, and beyond, to the many other Black units that are serving throughout the country. One of my favorite scenes, that scene marching through Boston before they end up on ships, transports down to South Carolina. This did take place. In fact, when you see that wonderful relief sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens at the end of the movie, that's right across from the State House on atop Beacon Hill, that features Shaw and his men. This is the moment that memorial commemorates, the march through Boston at the end of May 1863. You can actually see Shaw's home, where the family stood on the balcony looking down at Shaw as he marches with his men. That house is still standing right across from the Boston Common. But it also, I think, is an opportunity to highlight the fact that Boston was quite ambivalent about these men. Certainly, you would find newspapers that supported the raising of Black soldiers, but you don't have to look far to find people who are disgusted by this very sight, disgusted by the idea of Black men shouldering weapons. That this war is now not just simply a war to preserve the Union, but a war that could fundamentally overturn the racial hierarchy, not just in slavery, not just in terms of slavery, but perhaps even threaten the racial hierarchy in the free states. And so this is seen as problematic throughout the country. And let's face it, it's a huge political risk for Lincoln and the Republicans. But of course, it's seen as a political or military necessity, I should say. Another point, I think, that highlights some of the history that could have been, emphasized a bit more. This is, of course, on the way down to South. I think they're actually along the Seacoast Islands in South Carolina, where Rawlins, played by Morgan Freeman, is promoted to Sergeant Major. And it does highlight the fact that you would have found promotions. There were promotions of Black men in the ranks. There were roughly 75, I believe, commissioned officers, Black officers, during the Civil War. Rawlins, I think, is sort of playing the role that Lewis Douglas, who also was a sergeant major in the 54th, was the son of Frederick Douglass, of course. I think his character, in some ways, at least in this respect here, is sort of nodding in that direction. But they do end up, for the first part of their tour of duty, along the Seacoast Islands, near Charleston, South Carolina. This is an area that had been occupied by the Union Army going back to November of '61. This is where Reconstruction really begins, with the occupation by the Union Army and the beginning of an attempt to recreate the South, where you have thousands of enslaved people flocking to the Seacoast Islands, who are being given property, who are farming, who are being educated, who are serving in the army. So this is a transformative moment that many of these men who've never experienced slavery or even traveled in the South are experiencing for the first time, as well as Shaw. But the real highlight of this moment is the raid on Darien in June of 1863. I think the movie does a wonderful job of depicting this scene. And it also, I think, highlights the problems that Shaw has with another colonel who is already present, along the seacoast islands, Colonel James Montgomery, who is actually, you can trace him back to the fighting on the Kansas frontier in the 1850s. He's a Kansas Jayhawker. He's fighting against the pro-slavery people on the Kansas frontier. Ends up serving, he's a minister, ends up serving in a regiment early in the war, and accepts command of the 2nd South Carolina in early 1863. He has a very different view of the war than Shaw does. Montgomery wants not just to see slavery abolished, but he wants to see white Southerners punished. He wants to see the South recreated, but he also harbors deeply racist views at the same time. He's an incredibly complex figure. He is the villain in this part of the movie for Shaw. And Shaw was certainly concerned about his unit's participation in the Darien raid. He was concerned about how it would reflect on his reputation, as well as the men in the 54th. But he actually had a fairly close relationship with Montgomery, and you can read Shaw's letters home, and he's taken by the man. And I think part of the reason why he was impressed by Montgomery is because Montgomery he was principled. He understood what the war was about from his point of view. And Shaw, I think, even during this point in time, he still harbors questions. He still harbors doubts about what will happen in the heat of battle. Again, what this means for his own professional future. But there are no questions in Montgomery, and so Shaw is quite impressed with the man. I just want to sort of real fast, one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. I think this scene in which Shaw asks Tripp to carry the battle flag and what will become the battle of the attack on Battery Wagner. He offers Tripp the opportunity to carry the regimental colors. And Tripp, of course, as many of you know, refuses. And it's just this wonderful interaction between the two, in which Tripp asks Shaw to sort of reflect on what this war will mean once it's over. And Shaw, of course, knows he will go home. He will go back to his wealthy family and success, hopefully. But for someone like Tripp, it's not clear what the war will bring. What will the war mean for 4 million enslaved people? What does a reunited nation, what does that mean to people like Tripp? And Shaw can't really answer that question, but it beautifully anticipates the challenges of Reconstruction, the horrors of Jim Crow. It anticipates the monument building that will begin in the 1890s, a Southern landscape that will be littered with Confederate monuments and no reminders of Black service in the military. And so it's a very poignant moment, a poignant scene right before that final scene in the movie. And I think that final scene, you don't hear me talk much about, or you won't hear me talk much about the battle scenes. I think they're beautifully done. But I've never served in the military. I've never seen battles. So in terms of realism, I think they're really well done, and I'll leave it at that. And I think this scene, yes, they march up the wrong side of the beach. Okay, that's not a very serious problem. But I think it certainly captures Shaw's final moments from what little we know about his final moments on the battlefield. And certainly it does a very good job of capturing the aftermath. The dead on the beach, the way they were buried. Shaw was in fact buried with his men on the beach. His family did have the opportunity to disinter his remains and bring them back to Boston, but they thought, he would rather remain buried with his men, and so that remains a very powerful moment, I think, at the end of the movie. The movie, of course, ends with the relief of Augusta St. Gaudens, right? Which was dedicated in 1897 on the Boston Common, like I said, right across from the State House. I think a couple things about this that are really important. It's really the only, in terms of monumentation, really the only reminder of Black military service during the Civil War. This was originally supposed to just feature Shaw, but as St. Gaudens continued to think through the project, he eventually decided on depicting Shaw marching with his men. And the men, the faces, if you look closely, this is under, it's being restored right now. But if you look very closely at the faces, these were cast from real men, from Black men who came to St. Gaudens' studio, posed for him. And so in terms of also depicting, realistic Black features, at a time when, of course, African Americans are depicted in horrible ways in popular culture, this one really stands out. And it stands out in contrast to how the service of Black men and Black people generally during the Civil War, it stands out in sharp contrast to how they're depicted in the monuments at this time. And I bring this up because we are in the midst of a monument debate. But the vast majority of Confederate monuments that depict African Americans depict the loyal slaves. And one of the best examples is the Confederate monument in Arlington Cemetery, dedicated in 1914. The middle of the cemetery, surrounded by roughly 360 Confederate soldiers that were disinterred from area cemeteries, brought to Arlington National Cemetery. You can't miss this monument. It is the largest monument, I believe, in the entire cemetery. You can't miss it, but unless you know where to go when you visit Arlington, very few people will ever visit the African Americans that are buried in Section 27 of Arlington. Former United States Confederate colored troops, contraband who found their way to DC during the war, who are buried there. And here's a close-up of the Confederate monument in Arlington. You can see just to center right, the figure of the Black Mammy, the loyal slave taking the child from the Confederate soldier and going off to war. And you can, of course, read it for yourself in a sense, right? Don't worry about your child. I will take good care of him. I will remain loyal to you and the Confederacy. Go to just center left, and you can see the image of what looks like a Black uniformed man. He is, in fact, uniformed. But this is a wonderful example of the loyal body servant that I write about in Searching for Black Confederates. This was not a soldier. No one understood this man as a soldier in 1914. This was a loyal slave marching off with his master during the war. So a great example of the monumentation of the time that in effect erases the achievements and memory of Black soldiers. So I wanted to end with that, just to sort of bring this to 2021 and sort of emphasize why this movie, or one of the reasons why I think this movie still matters so much. So I rushed through a lot, and I want to leave as much time for Q&A to go where you want to go. And so I'm going to stop here and stop sharing. If I have to go back, I will. But just to give you guys a chance to chime in.
All right, perfect. So we had quite a few questions sort of roll in through the program. So I will just go in the order that we got them.
Let's do it.
You actually already touched a little bit on the first one. Someone asked, do you think this movie sort of accurately portrays the brutality of Civil War warfare? So feel free to
Yeah,
it.
I do. I think certainly, if you read up on the production of the movie, there were a number of historical advisors. Brian Pohanka, if you know anything about sort of the Civil War community, one of the most respected Civil War reenactors. He passed away a number of years ago, but he was on the scene, on the set, as they say. Greg Irwin, a military historian who still teaches at Temple University, he was also serving as a military advisor. They're both actually in the movie. So in terms of the military aspect of it, the battle scenes, I think those are done actually quite well. And there are a couple moments in particular, that close hand-to-hand fighting that takes place at Battery Wagner. One of the things that I didn't mention that's important to bring up, and the movie does this really well, there's a wonderful moment where the proclamation from the Confederacy is read that effectively reduces Black soldiers to slaves in rebellion. In other words, the Confederacy, when they learn of the recruitment of these men, basically declares that if these men are captured on the battlefield, they will be treated as slaves in rebellion, and their white officers treated as inciting slave rebellion. And this does play out during the war. My first book was about the Battle of the Crater in July of 1864, where an entire division of black soldiers is involved in a very violent battle, and upwards of 200 are executed by Confederate soldiers, either during the battle after they surrendered or after the battle altogether. There's obviously Fort Pillow in Tennessee. There are a number of other examples. So that kind of intense, close combat, I think, brings out the fury that would have animated Confederates, whether they were slaveholders or non-slaveholders.
That is actually an amazing segue to my next question, the mention of the Battle of the Crater, which is that this movie focuses on a Massachusetts regiment. It takes place mostly in South Carolina, but we are the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So why did we cover this movie? So can you just chat a little bit about the role of Virginia in the U.S. colored troops, or the role of the U.S. colored troops in Virginia, and sort of how those two worlds meshed during the war?
Well, I mean, certainly, enslaved men, as in other Confederate states, and again, as Virginia obviously is, I think, for many people, the center of the war. This is where the most important fighting is taking place, I think, militarily, politically, in terms of how both sides viewed the evolution of the war. And so certainly, African Americans, enslaved men, have the opportunity to escape from their masters, end up at places like Fortress Monroe on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, and other places where contraband camps are set up, and out of that, regiments are beginning to form by 1863. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the crater in Virginia in July of '64 is that there's a little bit of fighting beforehand in which African Americans are involved. But the crater is really the first moment where Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is facing a significant number of Black soldiers. And I think it's important for your understanding of the war in Virginia, because I sort of alluded to this a minute ago, because I think at this moment in the summer of 1864, a moment where I think many people already see the war as over, right? Anything after Gettysburg, it's just icing on the cake, right? Appomattox is just a few months away. From the perspective of Confederates, again, regardless of whether they were slave owners or not, the presence of these men in Virginia, I think, reinforces for them just what is at stake. They are confronted by their worst nightmares. Virginia is the state where Nat Turner's rebellion takes place. So there's a memory of slave unrest, right? And so I think that's a realization for many Virginians who are at the crater, and and Confederates from other states, who I think are confronted by, again, their worst nightmare, right? And so I think for any number of reasons, Virginia is really important, when it comes to this story.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, for everyone watching, I have a great quote from a letter that I will send out in tomorrow's follow-up email, from a white officer talking about how valiantly the Black U.S. colored troops at the Battle of the Crater fought. So a very similar sort of on the front line scene like we see in Glory.
Yeah, I mean, you can find a range of views when it comes to how enlisted men and white officers evaluate the service of Black soldiers. Glory, at the end, sort of glosses over the complexity. Glory, in a sense, presents this as, well, they have proven themselves. The problem with ending at Wagner is it doesn't allow us to really understand much of anything about what's to follow, especially when it comes to Reconstruction. If service in the military is so crucial in terms of proving yourself, then how do we explain all of the post-war, many of the post-war problems? And certainly some people were impressed by it. Not everyone, far from the case. So there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. And I think that that sort of leads in. We had actually quite a few people in the chat ask a question about, maybe the hardships depicted in Glory, specifically as related to this regiment, weren't necessarily true, but
Right.
were those decisions made by the filmmakers to address issues of racism that still existed in the North to other USCT regiments? Just because slavery wasn't existing certainly doesn't mean that racism and hardships by those troops wasn't existing.
Yeah, and I think you can't underestimate just the depth of racism in in the United States. Unless you're John Brown, everyone's a racist. At least from our standards,
From our modern perspective.
Our modern perspective. I'm doing some research right now on the 29th Connecticut, which was raised in 1864, a black unit, and when you read the debates about whether to raise this regiment, in the state legislature, I mean, it's as if sometimes you feel as if you're reading, the record of a southern state, a slave state. I mean, obviously they wouldn't be talking about the raising of a black regiment, but in terms of how African Americans are characterized, I think we underestimate the extent to which the vast majority of the loyal white citizenry of the North was committed to a war for union. I mean, if in the end they do gravitate to supporting emancipation, it's because it will lead to the union being preserved faster, right? So it has instrumental value. And I'm not suggesting that no one evolves to the point where they arrive at a point where they see the problem of slavery, the immorality of slavery. It's just that I think that quite often it's the problem of presentism that we end up applying sort of our own standards to the 1860s. And I don't think that's necessarily how they viewed the war around them and its evolution. But yeah, absolutely. I think, and I try to sort of point out that Boston is incredibly racist when it comes to this. Boston, this is the city that turns back fugitive slaves in the 1850s. I mean, there are people who want to protect them, and there are certainly plenty of people who want to send them back during a number of moments in the 1850s. But there's discrimination everywhere, and I think the movie does a decent job of capturing that within the military, because it certainly was there, and you certainly can't emphasize it enough, no doubt.
Yeah. Absolutely. And characters coming sort of to terms with racist biases that they did not even necessarily know that they had, because it had not presented to them yet.
Yeah, remember, there are relatively few free African Americans in the North, right? I mean, the vast majority of African Americans live in the slaveholding South. And so I think it is a shock for many people once they are confronted in certain ways as a result of the evolution of the war.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, let's think about what are some other recommendations for Civil War movies or Reconstruction era movies that you would recommend that you think do either a really good job or like a job that is bad enough to say maybe it's not even worth showing it in your class because there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of the latter is, I'm not even sure I made it through the entire movie when I was in the theater. But Gods and Generals. I mean, to me, that's just a god-awful movie. On so many levels, it is just incredibly irresponsible. But again, on the flip side, I think a movie like Lincoln, although I think it also has problems, I think it does a wonderful job of capturing sort of the political milieu of those events that led up to the passage of the 13th Amendment, even though it doesn't get that entire story right. What else out there? What else is out there? I'm thinking, I'm drawing, there's so many movies out there, but I'm drawing a blank right now. Oh, geez.
Well, I'll say that we did movie Mythbust Lincoln, and we had chatted about doing Gods and Generals, but sort of our education team's general consensus was also that it was a little bit irresponsible for us to legitimize any part of that film because there was so much to unpack with it. So, I mean, we completely agree. Oh, how is Ken Burns' The Civil War aged? Actually, it's a great question.
Well, okay. I'm a huge fan of Ken Burns's documentary. I get into a lot of trouble on social media for it. There's been sort of a call in recent months, for a new Civil War documentary. And I think actually I agree with that. I think after 30 years, I think it's time for a documentary that reflects many of the changes in the scholarship, which have been really significant. At the same time, I think that right now, as opposed to the Civil War, Reconstruction might be a more important time period for us to really pay attention to. And I think Henry Louis Gates recently did a wonderful documentary on the history of Reconstruction, including the memory of Reconstruction. But in terms of Ken Burns, obviously, I think it has problems with the lost cause at certain places, that lost cause narrative. I think certainly Shelby Foote sometimes will make you cringe. And he is certainly the most notable talking head from that movie. But at the same time, I think Ken Burns does a great job with other aspects of the war. I think along with Glory, it packs a double punch in the way it focuses on emancipation, even slavery as a cause of the war, United States colored troops. And I think one of the aspects of that documentary that's often overlooked is the Civil War does a great job with the home front, sort of explaining how the home front and the military decisions and the battlefield interconnect throughout the war on both sides. And so in certain ways, I think that period around 1989, 1990 is it's a transformative moment. We're clearly moving away from that lost cause narrative, haven't given it up altogether. But both of these, Glory and the Civil War, I think in some ways anticipate the next 30 years of how the country is going to evolve, both in terms of scholarly output, the kinds of histories that are produced, but also just the way in which Americans are thinking about the war, how it's being taught in the classroom, right? Textbooks before Glory in the 1980s, it's hard to imagine this. Remember this, very few of them talked about Black Civil War soldiers, right? And so I think, again, it's I don't think you can underestimate the importance of both.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually have a program that looks at that Rachel, one of our educators, developed that looks at textbooks from Reconstruction, from the early 20th Civil Rights Movement, and then the 2010 Virginia textbook, and looks at how they talk about African Americans in the Civil War, how that has really led to a misunderstanding of the Civil War.
Yeah, and the 2010 Virginia book obviously includes the reference to Black Confederate soldiers, which was obviously problematic. But Virginia in the 1950s and 60s rewrote its textbooks as a form of massive resistance against civil rights. And those books were still being used into the late 1970s in some counties in Virginia. So it does speak to the importance of, how we teach American history, especially, such key moments like the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any scenes from Glory specifically that you would sort of hang your hat on as like a great scene to use as a high school classroom, or paired with a great primary source? We have quite a few teachers tuning in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's great that people are thinking along these lines. But that scene that I described between Tripp and Shaw about from Tripp's perspective, what do we get from this war, right? And I think if you use that scene, and the way I actually rarely showed all of Glory. I would show certain scenes in the classroom, but I would actually show that scene to the end of the movie. And then what I would do, the sources that I've typically used along with it are one of Frederick Douglass's speeches, post-war speeches. And I mean, usually an excerpt from his 1876. So you can go 1876 dedication speech at the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. I think there's one in 1871 that he gives. Actually, any number of Douglas speeches post-war get at his concern with the fragility of the memory of the war. This concern on his part that the story of African Americans is going to be pushed aside, and he was right about that in large part. And so anything with Frederick Douglass, I think also. You can use any number of Thomas Nast cartoons.
We love Thomas Nast.
Yeah, I mean, there's some wonderful images of the veterans, the Black veteran, right, voting, being presented by sort of the Lady Liberty figure, right, to the country who's lost a leg. So Thomas Nast cartoons, and then anything sort of Lost Cause-esque, anything that sort of captures. And it could be a monument. It could be a sort of the Confederate monument that I just showed you guys, where you're able, I think, to reflect on the power that these monuments still wield, right? The ways in which these are not passive artifacts. They have always functioned to control whose stories get told and whose stories get pushed aside. So there are any number of ways you can kind of bundle together primary sources. And I think if you are a teacher listening, I think it's important. Hollywood movies can be incredibly helpful as teaching sources. But the worst thing, obviously, you can do is just, put on a Hollywood movie that's historically based, hit play, and just walk away. Really try to figure out why it is that you're showing the movie and see it as a primary source. Right. And I also think Ken Burns is a primary source. I mean, whenever I use Ken Burns, I ask my students to think about, why does he use this kind of music? Right? Why is it that photograph that he's using? Could have used any number of photographs, right? So all kinds of questions about how these narratives are stitched together, and understanding that historical truth is not always at the top of the list, right? In terms of what you're going for, right?
And understanding that different people have different truths, even if we don't necessarily agree with all of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I did just have a question that I think is going to be difficult for you to answer in the about 5 minutes that we have left, because you just wrote a whole book on it. But someone asked, why do you sort of keep referring to this myth of the Black Confederate? Were there no Black Confederate soldiers?
Well, I can answer that. I've had so much practice with this, and I thank you for the question. It's a myth, at least if you were to ask any Confederate between 1861 and 1865. As far as real Confederates were concerned, the war began and ended as a white man's war. Now, of course, in March 1865, the Confederate Congress did pass legislation that began the process of recruiting Black men. A very small group of men were recruited in Richmond in the final weeks of the war. They were housed in a jail. They may have marched once or twice down Broad Street. There's no evidence they were given rifles or any weapons, and there's no evidence that they ever saw the battlefield. And this was obviously a last-ditch attempt. But leading up to that moment, from roughly the spring of 1864 through March of 65, the Confederacy engaged in a very open debate about whether or not to recruit Black men as soldiers. You can read the editorials and now for the rest of your life. And what's fascinating is, in all of the 10 plus years that I spent researching this and reading these documents, not once, regardless of their position on whether or not to enlist Black men or not, I found not a single example from anyone in the Army, on the home front, or in the government who said, by the way, there are already Black men serving as soldiers in the Army. As far as I can tell in my research, and I document this in the book, the first references to Black Confederate soldiers don't appear until the 1970s. This is a modern myth. Real Confederates, if they were with us today, I think they would be dumbfounded by this discussion about Black Confederate soldiers. So I can only, I'll stop there and just say, read the book. But I thank you for the question.
And we will also, Kevin did a great banner lecture at our museum pre-COVID times,
Thanks.
and we have a recording of it, so we will send that out as well. It is fascinating. I am from South Carolina. Denzel Washington, I believe, said that when he was filming Glory, that the thought of Black people in the Civil War at all had just like never occurred to him. And I can say the same is true for me. I never thought about the role of African Americans or enslaved people or free Black people.
That's right.
At all growing up. I don't think it was addressed at all in my South Carolina.
Yeah, that's right. And when I was researching my Crater book, and I was living in Charlottesville at the time, I drove up to DC to the new African American Museum, where they had, back in '98, they dedicated a monument, but they were building a new museum. And I went up there and I scheduled an interview with some of the extras who played soldiers in the 54th during the filming of Glory. 5 of them. We sat down for a couple hours, and not one of them learned about Black Civil War soldiers, right? And so for them, it was a real education. It was a powerful education, through the process of filming this movie.
Yep. All right, guys, I know that we are coming close to 8 o'clock. A couple of you are saying your goodbyes and thank yous. So I will, Kevin, leave you with this one last question and a giant thank you. Someone asked, how do you think we are going to be studying the Civil War in 100 years? Certainly it has changed in the last 100. Are we still going to be as obsessed with it as we are now? What does the future of Civil War scholarship look like?
Yeah, I can't, obviously I'm not in the prediction business as a historian, but it's a reasonable, that's right, I only look back, but it's a reasonable question to ask. And I got to tell you, I'm always sort of surprised by the renewed interest, in the war. Obviously right now we are going through a very dramatic moment, very controversial, divisive moment. Over the question of monuments and memorials, specifically Confederate monuments and memorials. That's something I did not anticipate, right? I really thought that coming out of the Civil War 150th celebrations, which ended in 2015, I thought, well, that's pretty much it in terms of public interest in the Civil War. I don't know whether I'll be alive for the bicentennial, but here we are, right? And we're here for the most horrible of reasons, beginning with the murder of 9 people in Charleston, jumping to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and then obviously the recent police killing of George Floyd. So it's and that has, I think, renewed interest in the war, in the legacy of the war, in a way in which I don't think we've ever seen before, or well, at least recently. So it's really difficult to know what is going to trigger that same kind of interest in the future. For now, I'm going to be interested in seeing how cities like Richmond and other places begin the process of figuring out what to do with their landscapes, which have been utterly changed. Most dramatic ways. And we are going to see at some point soon the Robert E. Lee Monument come down in Richmond. That's going to continue, I think, to raise interest in the war and its legacy, its memory. So who knows what happens from that point on. It's really interesting. It's exciting.
It's exciting. I know. I agree. For people who look back a lot, it's interesting to think about the next big thing that's going to make us think about all the things that came before.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, everyone, thank you for coming. We will send out resources tomorrow about, the Civil War, about Kevin, about his books, his blog. And I know that we did not get to all of your questions. So if there's anything that you are dying to know and we could not get to it, please just answer our email tomorrow, and we will answer you back. All right.
Sounds good.
Bye, guys.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Stay safe.